The laughter did not last. It thinned out the way sound does before a thunderstorm, replaced by the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the metallic scrape of trays against bolted tables. Trent straightened, rolling his shoulders as if he had all the time in the world. He liked stretching moments. It made people nervous. Danielle remained seated, her back aligned with the edge of the bench, her boots planted flat against the concrete floor. 24 feet to the exit. 9 feet to the kitchen door. 3 guards in view. 1 distracted. 1 watching. 1 pretending not to notice. Officer Megan Doyle shifted her weight near the double doors, arms folded, eyes moving between Trent and the security mirror mounted high in the corner. She had worked Block D for 3 years. She knew the rhythm. Trent provoked. Someone reacted. Paperwork followed. But this felt different. The woman at the table was not shrinking. She was measuring. "You deaf or just slow?" Trent asked, tapping the edge of Danielle's tray again. The plastic fork rattled. A few inmates leaned forward, eager for a reaction. Danielle lifted the fork, set it back down deliberately, and then finally spoke. Her voice was low, steady, almost conversational. "I am neither." The answer was simple. Calm. It did not carry the tremor Trent expected. A ripple moved through the cafeteria. Trent tilted his head slightly, studying her now, really studying her. There was no shake in her hands. No tightening in her jaw. No flare of panic in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had already played this scene out in her mind and knew how it would end. What Trent did not know was that Danielle had spent her first 72 hours inside Blackridge memorizing more than faces. She had mapped camera angles by watching reflections in polished metal. She had timed guard rotations down to the minute by counting the echo of boots in the corridor. She had chosen that seat because it gave her a clear view of every entrance without turning her head. She had allowed herself to appear isolated because isolation drew predators faster than confidence ever could. Trent leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You think you are special?" he asked. Danielle's gaze flicked briefly to his right wrist, where a faded tattoo wrapped around bone and vein. Then, back to his eyes. "No," she said. "I think you are predictable." That word landed harder than any raised voice could have. A few inmates shifted uncomfortably. Cole stepped forward half a pace, unsure whether to laugh or brace. Officer Doyle narrowed her eyes. Predictable was not a word people used around Trent. It suggested control. And control was something Trent guarded fiercely. He let out a short laugh, louder than necessary, turning to the room as if inviting them to share the joke. But the sound rang hollow. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had not reacted the way he wanted. Danielle reached for her cup of water, taking a small sip, movements precise. She was not challenging him. She was calibrating him. And somewhere deep beneath the noise and bravado, a subtle shift began to take place. Not in the room. Not in the guards. In Trent. Because predators who thrive on fear grow uneasy when fear never arrives. And Danielle Carter had not come to Blackridge to survive the system. She had come to understand it. And understanding always comes before change. By the time lunch ended, the story had already spread through Block D like electricity through copper wiring. The quiet woman at table 7 had not flinched. She had not apologized. She had not looked away. In a place where eye contact was currency and silence was often mistaken for weakness, that kind of composure did not go unnoticed. Danielle walked back to her cell in measured steps, counting the seconds between the buzz of the gate and the heavy click of the lock behind her. 8 seconds. Same as yesterday. She stepped inside without hesitation. Her cellmate, Lila Monroe, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a habit of speaking too quickly when nervous, sat cross-legged on the lower bunk. "You should not have said that," Lila whispered the moment the corridor quieted. Danielle folded her blanket with deliberate precision before answering. He asked a question. Her tone remained even. Lila shook her head. No one calls Trent predictable. Norton walks away from it. Danielle did not respond immediately. She moved to the small metal sink, ran the water for exactly 5 seconds, then turned it off. Even here, she paid attention to sound. In Blackridge, noise carried stories faster than words. Outside the cell, footsteps echoed down. The tier. Inmates murmured. A few glanced toward Danielle's door as they passed, curiosity mixed with something else. Respect. Not admiration. Not yet. But the beginning of reassessment. On the opposite end of the block, Trent leaned against the railing of the upper tier, staring down at the floor below. Cole stood beside him, shifting uneasily. She is just playing calm, Cole muttered. You will deal with her. Trent did not answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly. He replayed the cafeteria exchange in his mind, searching for a crack in her expression, a flicker of doubt he might have missed. There had been none. That unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. Officer Megan Doyle watched from the control desk, her fingers resting lightly on the incident log she had not needed to fill out. She had seen fear. She had seen bravado. Danielle Carter had shown neither. Instead, she had shown restraint. That was rarer. And far more dangerous. Back inside her cell, Danielle sat on the lower bunk and closed her eyes, not to rest, but to review. She replayed Trent's posture, the angle of his shoulders, the slight delay before he laughed. She catalogued reactions the way other inmates collected favors. Predictable was not an insult. It was a diagnosis. And diagnosis led to leverage. Lila leaned closer. You are not scared, she asked quietly. Danielle opened her eyes and met her gaze. Fear is information, she said. It tells you what someone wants. Lila frowned, not understanding. Danielle did not elaborate. She did not explain that real power was rarely loud. It was patient. It allowed others to move first. Down the tier, Trent pushed off the railing and began descending the metal stairs, boots striking each step with measured force. He did not like loose ends. And in his world, unpredictability was a threat. What he did not realize was that the woman behind cell door 14 had already calculated the next move he would make. Because when someone builds their reputation on dominance, they always follow the same pattern when challenged. And Danielle Carter had spent her life studying patterns. That evening the air in Block D felt heavier, as if the concrete itself were holding its breath. Dinner trays had come and gone, the corridor lights dimmed to their muted nighttime setting, and yet movement continued beneath the surface. Danielle sat cross-legged on the lower bunk, her back straight against the cinderblock wall, listening to the rhythm of the tier. Footsteps traveled differently at night. Guards walked with routine. Inmates walked with intention. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. Lila paced the narrow space between the bunk and the bars, glancing out every few seconds. He is going to do something, she whispered. He always does. Danielle tilted her head slightly, focusing on a distant echo of boots striking metal stairs. Slow. Controlled. Not rushed. Yes, she said quietly. He will. Across the tier, Trent paused halfway down the staircase, resting one hand on the railing as he surveyed the block below. The overhead lights cast long shadows across his face, sharpening the angles of his expression. He did not shout. He did not call attention to himself. That was not the move tonight. Instead, he spoke to Cole in a low voice, the kind that carried just enough to be heard by the right ears. Laundry detail runs at 9, he said. Plenty of noise. Plenty of blind spots. Cole nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. On the opposite end of the corridor, Officer Megan Doyle checked the monitor feeds in the control booth. Camera 3 flickered for a fraction of a second before stabilizing. She frowned. Maintenance had been slow to respond to repeated requests about faulty wiring. In a place built on routine, even small glitches created openings. Back inside cell 14, Danielle rose from the bunk and stepped toward the bars. She did not lean out. She did not strain to see. She simply listened. The timing was almost exact. 9 minutes until 9 o'clock. Laundry detail meant movement. Movement meant distraction. Distraction meant opportunity. Lila stopped pacing. You are not thinking about going down there, are you? Danielle looked at her reflection in the scratched metal sink, adjusting the sleeve of her uniform with precise fingers. Sometimes, she said evenly, the safest place to stand is where everyone expects you to run. Lila swallowed, uncertain whether that was wisdom or warning. A loud buzz echoed through the corridor as the tier gate unlocked for scheduled movement. Inmates stepped out in small groups, some heading toward the laundry room at the far end where industrial dryers hummed like distant engines. The smell of detergent mixed with warm concrete. Trent moved with purpose, not rushing, but aligning himself near the doorway that led to the narrow hallway between the laundry area and the storage closet. A hallway known for shadows. Danielle waited exactly 3 seconds after the second group passed before stepping out of her cell. Not hurried. Not hesitant. She joined the flow as though she had every reason to be there. Officer Doyle watched from the booth, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tracked the movement pattern on the monitors. Something about the symmetry felt deliberate. Down the hallway, the industrial machines roared to life, masking smaller sounds. Trent positioned himself near the corner, arms folded, confidence returning now that the setting favored him. He believed he had chosen the moment. What he did not realize was that Danielle had predicted it the instant he paused on that staircase. Because patterns do not change simply because the stage does. And as the hum of machinery filled the air, the distance between them narrowed to less than 12 feet. Close enough for tension to replace noise. Close enough for the next move to begin. For a moment neither of them moved. The dryers continued their heavy rotation, metal against metal, a steady mechanical heartbeat that filled the narrow corridor. Trent stood close enough to feel the warmth rising from Danielle's shoulders, close enough to convince himself he still controlled the distance. But control was not measured in inches. It was measured in awareness. Danielle's eyes did not waver. They did not challenge. They assessed. She noticed the slight tightening in his jaw, the subtle shift of his right foot as he adjusted his balance, the way his breath grew just a fraction louder when his confidence met resistance. You planned this, Trent said, though it sounded more like a realization than an accusation. Danielle tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement without confirming it. You always choose enclosed spaces, she replied evenly. Limited exits. High noise. Fewer witnesses. She spoke as if describing weather patterns. Trent's expression hardened. You think you have me figured out? The question carried more edge than before. Around them, other inmates slowed their movements without appearing to stop. A cart rolled past. A dryer door slammed shut somewhere behind them. Cole shifted again near the entrance, uncertainty creeping into his posture. Danielle took a single controlled breath. She did not step forward. She did not step back. Instead, she adjusted her stance by a fraction, aligning her shoulders with the corridor rather than directly with Trent. It was a subtle repositioning, but it changed everything. She was no longer squared against him. She was angled toward the exit. Toward visibility. Toward light. You built your reputation on predictability, she said calmly. People respond the way you expect. That is how you stay in charge. Trent gave a short, humorless laugh. And you are different. Danielle's gaze flicked upward for less than a second. The flickering overhead light buzzed again. The camera mounted in the corner caught the shift in shadow. She knew exactly when it stabilized. Yes, she answered. The word was quiet. Absolute. Something in the hallway shifted then. Not physically. Psychologically. Trent had spent years conditioning this block to react to tone and posture. But Danielle did not respond to tone. She responded to variables. And in that moment, he realized she was not improvising. She was executing a sequence already calculated. He extended his arm slightly again, testing the boundary without crossing into obvious misconduct. Danielle moved before he completed the gesture, not aggressively, not forcefully, simply redirecting the space between them with precise timing. Her hand brushed his forearm just enough to alter its path, guiding it downward with controlled pressure that looked almost incidental to anyone watching from a distance. It lasted less than a second. No raised voices. No spectacle. But Trent felt it. The balance shift. The subtle loss of center. Danielle released contact immediately, returning her hands to her sides as if nothing had happened. "You see," she said softly. "Predictable." Trent stepped back half an inch without meaning to. The motion was small, almost invisible, but Cole noticed. So did the inmate near the doorway. And in the control booth down the hall, Officer Megan Doyle leaned closer to the monitor, replaying the last 5 seconds in her mind. She had not seen a strike. She had not seen escalation. But she had seen precision. Back in the corridor, the hum of the machines returned to dominance, swallowing the silence that followed. Danielle did not smile. She did not taunt. She simply held his gaze one final second before stepping around him, unhurried, moving toward the main corridor as if the encounter had been nothing more than routine. Trent remained in place, shoulders squared, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since he had taken control of Block D, someone had entered his chosen arena and left on their own terms. And as Danielle's footsteps faded into the echo of the tier, it became clear that this had not been a confrontation. It had been a demonstration. The corridor outside the laundry room did not erupt. It did not explode into chaos. It simply absorbed what had happened and held it in silence. Danielle walked with the same measured pace she had entered with, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward, as if the past 30 seconds had been nothing more than a shift in air pressure. Behind her, the industrial dryers continued their rotation, steady and indifferent, but the people inside that hallway were no longer indifferent. Cole stared at Trent, waiting for a command that did not come. The other inmate near the doorway lowered his gaze, not out of fear but recalculation. Something unspoken had just changed the hierarchy of the room. Trent remained still for 2 full seconds after Danielle passed him. 2 seconds in a place where dominance was measured in reactions. His mind replayed the brief contact, the subtle redirection of his arm, the effortless way she had stepped around him without force, without visible strain. It had not been strength that unsettled him. It had been control. He turned slowly, watching her retreating figure merge back into the main corridor light. It was nothing, he muttered, more to himself than to Cole. But the words lacked conviction. Across the tier, Officer Megan Doyle kept her eyes on the monitor feed. She rewound the last few moments in her head, analyzing posture and movement the way she had been trained during academy drills. There had been no clear violation. No raised voices. No visible aggression. Yet she had seen something unmistakable. Precision. Danielle had not reacted. She had anticipated. Back inside cell 14, Lila stood when Danielle entered, searching her face for signs of strain. "What happened?" she asked quickly. Danielle closed the cell door behind her as the evening lockdown buzzed into place. "He confirmed my assessment," she replied. Lila blinked. "Assessment?" Danielle sat on the lower bunk, folding her hands loosely in her lap. "He relies on repetition," she said calmly. "Tonight he attempted to escalate without crossing a line. Tomorrow he will try again, but differently. He will not want witnesses. He will want privacy." Lila's eyes widened. "So you are just waiting for that?" Danielle's gaze lifted, steady and unreadable. "I am not waiting," she said. "I am guiding." On the upper tier, Trent paced the length of the railing, boots striking metal in sharp, controlled beats. He could feel eyes on him now, subtle but present. Respect built on intimidation required constant reinforcement. If someone disrupted that rhythm, it had to be corrected. But correction required certainty. And for the first time, he was not certain. He had expected fear. He had encountered calculation. Down the hall, the lights dimmed another shade as the facility shifted toward night protocol. Shadows stretched longer across concrete floors. In the quiet of her cell, Danielle leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes, not to rest, but to reconstruct every second of the hallway encounter. She adjusted variables in her mind the way others adjusted plans. Tomorrow would not unfold the same way. It would be sharper. More deliberate. And this time, the demonstration would not be subtle. Because predators who feel their control slipping do not retreat. They double down. And Danielle Carter had already prepared for that. Morning count at Blackridge arrived at 5:30 a.m. with the metallic rhythm of keys and the flat tone of names read into cold air. Danielle stood at the foot of her bunk when Officer Megan Doyle passed her cell, eyes forward, posture composed, as if nothing in the previous night had altered the balance of Block D. But balance had shifted. It moved like an invisible current through the tier, subtle yet undeniable. Inmates who once avoided her gaze now watched openly, not with challenge, but with curiosity. They had seen something in that hallway. Not a fight. Not chaos. A recalibration. Trent had not slept well. He had paced his cell until lights out and then lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the encounter in relentless loops. The problem was not what had happened. The problem was what had not happened. She had not reacted. She had not lost composure. She had not given him a moment to exploit. That absence gnawed at him more than any visible confrontation would have. After breakfast, word traveled quickly that Trent intended to clear the air in the rec yard during the mid-morning block. The yard at Blackridge was surrounded by 12-foot fencing topped with coiled wire, concrete benches lining the perimeter, cameras mounted high above the corners. Open space, but exposed. No blind hallway. No machinery to mask sound. Danielle heard the murmurs without turning her head. She adjusted the sleeves of her uniform and stepped into line for yard call when her tier was released. The sky above was pale blue, thin clouds stretching across it like brushed steel. The air carried a cool edge, somewhere near 50 degrees. Trent waited near the center of the yard, arms crossed, posture wide, confidence reconstructed for public display. Cole stood a few feet behind him, scanning faces. Officer Doyle monitored from the elevated walkway, radio clipped at her shoulder. Danielle walked onto the concrete with the same steady pace she had maintained since her arrival. No hurry. No hesitation. The yard quieted incrementally as she approached. Trent stepped forward, stopping a few feet from her. This time there was no whisper. No narrow hallway. His voice carried across open space. "You think you embarrass me?" he asked, loud enough for others to hear. Danielle's gaze moved briefly across the perimeter, noting camera placement, guard angles, inmate clusters. Then she returned her attention to him. "No," she answered calmly. "You embarrassed yourself." A ripple moved through the yard. Trent took another step forward, posture squared, attempting to reassert physical presence without crossing into overt misconduct. Danielle did not retreat. Instead, she shifted slightly to the side, altering the line between them so that Trent now stood directly in the center of camera range. Subtle. Precise. Intentional. "You keep saying I am predictable," Trent said, voice tight. "Explain." Danielle held his gaze, expression composed. "You escalate in private," she replied evenly. "When that fails, you perform in public. Because you believe reputation equals control." The words were measured, not loud, yet they carried. Several inmates exchanged glances. Cole shifted his stance. Officer Doyle leaned forward slightly on the walkway. Trent felt the shift again, the same subtle destabilization from the hallway, but magnified by witnesses. Danielle had not challenged him physically. She had exposed his pattern. And in a place where power depended on perception, exposure was more disruptive than confrontation. For a long second, neither moved. The wind brushed across the yard, tugging at loose fabric. Danielle stood relaxed, hands at her sides, posture balanced. She was not reacting. She was directing. And as Trent realized that every step he took only reinforced her assessment, the open yard no longer felt like his stage. It felt like hers. The yard held its silence like a drawn breath. Trent stood in the center of open concrete, shoulders squared, but the certainty that once defined him no longer felt solid. Danielle had not raised her voice. She had not insulted him. She had simply described him. And in doing so, she had shifted the weight of the moment. Around them, inmates pretended to stretch, to pace, to look at the sky, but every eye tracked the space between the two of them. Officer Megan Doyle remained on the elevated walkway, posture alert, radio untouched. She had seen confrontations dissolve into chaos before. This was not chaos. This was control, and it did not belong to the person who usually held it. Trent exhaled slowly, attempting to recalibrate. "You talk like you studied this place," he said, tone forced into steadiness. Danielle did not blink. "I study systems," she replied. The wind moved across the yard again, light but noticeable, brushing the edges of her uniform. Trent stepped slightly to his left, trying to shift the dynamic, trying to reclaim physical dominance without crossing into an obvious violation. Danielle mirrored the movement in reverse, maintaining distance, maintaining angle, always keeping the camera line unobstructed. It was subtle choreography, invisible to most, unmistakable to those who understood positioning. "You are in here like the rest of us," Trent said. "You do not control anything." Danielle's gaze flicked briefly toward the guard tower, then back to him. "Control is not about noise," she said calmly. "It is about influence." The word landed heavier than the last. Influence. Several inmates lowered their eyes, not in submission, but in thought. Trent felt it. The shift was no longer theoretical. It was visible. He had relied on repetition for years. Intimidate. Escalate. Reinforce. But repetition only worked when outcomes remained predictable. Danielle had disrupted the outcome without ever disrupting the rules. And that was something he could not confront without exposing himself further. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he took a step back, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if adjusting his footing on uneven concrete. But everyone saw it. Cole saw it. The men near the fence saw it. Officer Doyle saw it. Danielle did not smile. She did not move forward. She simply held her stance, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, allowing the silence to complete what words had started. The yard slowly resumed motion. Conversations restarted in low tones. A basketball bounced once against the far wall. Trent turned away first, not hurried, not defeated, but altered. He walked toward the benches with measured steps, attempting to preserve dignity in retreat. Danielle remained where she was for 3 seconds longer, then shifted her gaze upward to the pale sky, as if confirming something only she understood. Back inside Block D later that afternoon, whispers carried a new undercurrent. Not fear. Not rebellion. Reassessment. Danielle returned to cell 14 with the same calm presence she had carried since day one. Lila looked at her differently now, less anxious, more certain. In the control booth, Officer Doyle logged nothing unusual. Because nothing visible had occurred. Yet everything had changed. And as the tier lights dimmed that evening, one truth settled into the concrete walls of Black Ridge: dominance built on intimidation can be dismantled without a single strike, if the person dismantling it understands the system better than the one who built it.